right, so welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining me for this talk today. Dawn of the death care industry. So we're going to be talking about death today. And there's a very wide variety of topics that are involved in this, especially in the 19th century. So I'm not only going to be covering the death care industry itself, but also kind of the culture of death that the Victorians very much embraced, a lot more than we do today. So death care is basically the funeral industry. It encompasses everything from the handling of the body to the directing of the funeral to the selling of any products and services related to death. And before the 19th century, this did not really exist in a concrete way. That was not a single profession. It was multiple things that eventually came together because of a few major catalysts or causes. I chose this topic because I've always kind of had a fascination with the macabre things in life, but I am also very squeamish, so a lot of it grossed me out really bad, and I will not be sharing any of the gorier or more gross things with you unless you really want to know, and then I can tell you. Now, I'll try to be as specific as I can without sharing any disturbing facts or anything, and so let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I'm going to discuss today is the Victorians and their culture of death. So for the Victorians, death was ever present. They dealt with death a lot more than we do today. Between the diseases that swept through cities like that, the settlers that were moving out west, they dealt with death as a much more common part of their reality. Sanitary conditions in the 19th century were not nearly as good, so a lot of people were dying a lot more often, and it was inescapable. And this is probably why the Victorians spent so much time thinking about and writing about death. The fascination with the morbid is, of course, very timeless, which is probably partially why you guys are all here today. And the Victorians were particularly guilty of that. And they were also professional mourners. So today, we are expected, when somebody dies, we are expected to eventually, within a few days, kind of pull ourselves together, go back to our job, go back to our lives. The Victorians would have been absolutely appalled by that. They thought that your mourning is your personality, and it's going to stay that way for at least a year after somebody dies. And so their mourning process could take for some years, and for some the rest of their entire life. So mourning is the mood of the day. So you could almost call mourning a fad in Victorian England especially, and fads are generally started by a celebrity. And their celebrity of that time was, of course, Queen Victoria. So Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861, and she spent the rest of her entire life in mourning for him, and that meant wearing black for the rest of her life. She lived another about 50 years past his death, and she always wore black. And that made it not only fashionable, but also very respectable and desirable for women to be in mourning. So she always devoted her life to her husband's memory. This is one of her mourning dresses that she wore quite often, and you can see from, this woman is kneeling. This was a very short woman. She was 5 feet tall, and that's it. So this was one of her mourning dresses. So this was a deathly obsession that the Victorians had. I have this book, which is called the Victorian Book of the Dead, and it's actually filled with newspaper articles, magazine articles that were basically about superstitions of death, ways people died, the death care industry, and just to kind of demonstrate how commonly and openly the Victorians actually wrote about this. Some of the details that they put into the newspaper articles at this time would never be written about today because they were sometimes very gory, and to kind of put that detail in today is considered very invasive and very disrespectful. But now, back then, they wanted to know it all and they wanted to share it all. So this type of information also sold very well, which is why they kept doing it, because people would buy a newspaper about somebody who got disemboweled or something like that. So I'm going to read a few very short excerpts from this, very short, that just kind of demonstrate some of the ways that they wrote about death. So this is from the Jackson Citizen Patriot. Presentiment of death he sought to forget was strangely fulfilled. Upper Sandusky, Ohio, July 26th. Fireman Douglas of the Pennsylvania Railroad attended a funeral of an aunt at Crestline, Ohio several weeks ago. Since that time, he was in constant fear of a tragic death. Every time he was called out, he had a presentiment that he would be brought back dead. A day or so ago, he asked a layoff so that he could return home and forget the presentiment. He returned home and was assisting in unloading hay. Lightning struck the barn and he was instantly killed. End of article. All right, 52. So there's another one. This one's a little bit more gruesome. A man hung by a corpse from the Weekly Vincennes Gazette, right here in Indiana. The Cincinnati Gazette states that on Saturday night, a fellow was stealing a dead body from the graveyard at Cumminsville near that city. When in crossing the fence, he slipped and fell on the outside, and the rope which held the sack containing the corpse sliding from his shoulders to his neck. At daylight, his body was found hanging on the outside of the graveyard fence, while the corpse he had stolen hung on the inside, both equally lifeless. So, they did not pull any punches. They wrote about everything. And you can see that there's always this kind of tongue-in-cheek way of writing about it, like it's kind of a silly thing. They're very matter-of-fact, and they definitely did not care if they were scarring you for life when they were writing this. So, just a couple of Victorian illustrations of death. So I want to talk a little bit, too, about the superstitions and symbols. The Victorians were very contradictory. On one hand, there were so many scientific advancements happening at this time, and at the other hand, they were very, very obsessed with superstition and spiritualism. So some of their superstitions, which by the way were very important and were not to be ignored. They had the Angel of Death and the Grim Reaper. These are pretty interchangeable. They both were symbolizing somebody who would come and take your soul after you died. However, the Angel of Death was usually more lovely. It was usually a woman. Sometimes it was an old woman. It was supposed to be a little bit more comforting, whereas the Grim Reaper is the Grim Reaper. He looks like a skeleton. So that is actually kind of a figure that came about because of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, if you guys are familiar with that. Death being a much more dead-looking figure. And the Grim Reaper, as we actually know it, was first written about in the United States in 1840, around that time. So that's about how old that is. Crepe, which I will be talking about quite a lot, was huge as a symbol and as a superstition. So crepe is essentially this matte silk gauze that was used. They wore it, and they also hung it on doorknobs when somebody died. And it was both because it was a sign of mourning and respect, and also there were superstitions around what would happen to the spirit if you did not do that. And there was a right way to use the right color, the right amount to correctly mourn, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Animals were also a huge superstition. A lot of different animals represented different things. So for instance, black dogs are a very common one in England. So if any of you guys have read Harry Potter, Sirius Black's character was a black dog. That's very intentional because before you know about his character, he is supposed to be this kind of looming symbol of death for Harry, and so they made him this black dog, which turns out that's just what he turns into. And then birds are also a pretty common one, so pigeons, doves, and that kind of thing. Miners would report seeing images of a woman in black in the mines that would symbolize a death was going to occur. The Irish have the banshee, and the banshee is one of the more disturbing ones to me because if you know about a banshee, they scream. And so the Irish believed that a banshee was this old, usually ugly woman that would scream or wail or sing, which would indicate that doom was coming, somebody was going to die or somebody has died. So people constantly reported having visions of coffins, of funerals, of any of these things, of their own graves, and these were very noteworthy, especially if they happened to somebody before they actually died. So these visions were reported on a lot of times and would put into the newspaper, and people would take a lot of fascination with people having these visions, which largely was due to spiritualism. Spiritualism was a huge movement in the 19th century. Again, the Victorians, they had Charles Darwin coming out with The Origin of Species. Religion is becoming a little less, on the side of science. But they were also into this belief that you could speak to the dead. So spiritualism essentially is a religious belief or practice based on supposed communication with the spirits of the dead, especially through mediums. Some of the people, and this is a little seance, illustration of a seance, some of the people that were very instrumental in making this happen were the Fox sisters of Rochester, New York. They are kind of cited as the rise or the cause of the craze of spiritualism. What started as a harmless prank, which by the way was on April 1st. So people really should have figured out that it was a prank from that alone. Claiming that they heard rapping or knocking on the walls in their home. And this just escalated because they thought it was so funny that people believed them that they kept doing it. And eventually they pretended to be mediums that could communicate with the dead. And they had people going for a very long time. Eventually they were discredited and pointed out as hoaxes, but it's still a lot of people believed it, and a lot of people wanted to, because this was the age of the Civil War, and after the Civil War, people were looking for any way to communicate with their loved ones. So that, on top of that, there was also spirit photography. So this was also obviously a hoax. Spirit photographers would make money by putting in the spirits of people's dead relatives into photographs. They would either do this by manipulating the light or the contents of the photo itself, using various methods or chemicals or photo or daguerreotype. And William Mumler was a major spirit photographer at that time, and he was credited with capturing the spirit of Abraham Lincoln standing behind his lovely wife, Mary Todd there. And Mary Todd was a major spiritualist. She believed that she was communicating with her husband and with her children when she had seances. And Queen Victoria also was regularly trying to communicate with her husband. Again, these, celebrity kind of figures are really into this, so people find legitimacy in that. Now, mourning. Mourning itself, people were obsessed with this kind of correct way to mourn. You had to mourn for the right amount of time, with the right amount of effort, and this led to a really obsessive interest in minor details. How thick are the black edges of my envelope? Is it too thin that people think I don't care about my dead husband? That kind of thing. How long should your crepe trimmings be? And the failure to mourn correctly reflected on you as a person. And because mourning clothes and materials were so expensive, there was something very inherently classist in this belief that if you were able to mourn, you were better than other people. So the rich were able to have not only a fashionable superiority, but also this moral superiority that they kind of held over the poor for being able to mourn. Now, crepe was the fashion of the day. It was the badge of the widow. They hung crepe on the doors. They wore crepe veils. That's veil right there. And hanging black crepe signified that the deceased was old. If you hung white, it meant that they were very young. But crepe was awful. It was an awful, awful material. It left stains. It easily ripped. It flaked. And when I say it left stains, I meant like on your skin. It left stains. It was saturated with poisonous chemicals that were usually deadly in and of themselves, including arsenic. They were absolutely loaded with arsenic. And here's a little bit of a better picture that you can see what it looks scratchy just looking at that picture. Like, I would not want to wear that. But it was also really expensive. So if, you had to choose, do I want my horrible health or do I want my social death? Like, do I want people to look down at me because I'm not wearing crepe, or do I want to, that kind of thing? Or do I want to get sick and have to deal with being sick from wearing it all the time? So that was a choice that they had to make. And unfortunately, they usually opted to just wear it. And it was so expensive, you couldn't just throw it away. So you just had to keep it. Yeah?
Were they aware of the health hazard?
They probably were beginning to realize, because it was something that they probably didn't realize what was making them so sick. They probably attributed it to the grief of the widow.
I see.
Yeah. So, and eventually, obviously we don't do it anymore, so they caught on, eventually that it was pretty bad. Men, on the other hand, men did not have to do nearly as much as women. A lot of times they already wore really dark clothes, so they didn't really have to change their wardrobe. And if they were in a mourning period, it was much shorter, and they were expected to remarry as soon as possible, because you can't expect a Victorian man to take care of his own kids. That's just not how that worked. So, And because of the high expense of mourning attire, it could be rented. Clothes dealers soon found that it was very lucrative to read the death notices in the paper, go to the homes of the people who had a deceased relative, and try to sell them clothes or rent them clothes. And they made a lot of money by doing this, so obviously it worked. And then companies also tried to sell mourning products, and I so wish I could find pictures of these because these are absolutely ridiculous. So anything on your person can basically be turned into mourning attire, especially if it was normally something that was white. So people were selling mourning rings, mourning umbrella handles, black bordered stationery and envelopes, stamps, mourning bicycle wheels, bathing suits, cigarettes. You know, your cigarette's a little too white, you gotta have some black cigarettes, and teddy bears. There were all sorts of things that if you saw an avenue to make money from that, people were doing it. So, and there are also stages of mourning. So usually full mourning is where you start, and then there's half mourning where you wear slightly different dark colors that aren't black. And then when a woman is finally ready to come out of mourning, she usually, if she's wealthy, will buy a whole new outfit and kind of come out again in society. And that was her way of saying she's ready to get married again. So death photography was also a very, very common practice at that time. In the 19th century, people died a lot of times before they were able to have their photos taken of them. So people definitely found a way to make money off of this. An early daguerreotypist used the following advertising slogan: "Secure the shadow ere the substance fades." And this encouraged people to have a picture taken of their loved ones either very soon before or soon after the people died. And that way they would have something to remember them by. It was a little bit gruesome because sometimes the photographer had to travel from far away, and you have a body sitting there. Earlier death photographers really wouldn't do much to make the deceased look better before photographing them. They just did it. Later on, they realized that they could apply makeup, they could alter the photo, they could sit them in poses to make them look a little bit more alive, and that became much more, the norm. Sadly, this most often happened to children because the children did not have a photo taken of them before they died. But as photography became more common, this practice definitely faded out because people had a picture of them. It became a lot cheaper to get your photo taken. So because of the nature of this photography and that it can be quite disturbing to look at if you're not used to it or not ready for it, I didn't put any in the slideshow, but I do have this book. It's called Beyond the Dark Veil. It has many, many examples in it. If you would like to see it after, you can look at it on your own. That way I'm not just like springing a dead body on you guys all of a sudden. Yeah.
There's a big controversy with those old photos.
Yeah.
Which ones they're actually deceased?
Yeah.
I've read a lot of that online.
Yeah, and the ones in here, I think most of them, they had written on them that the person was deceased, and that's how they knew for sure.
Some people say they would draw eyes, so it looked like their eyes were old.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's true.
I don't think there were any in here that were like that, but there were definitely some upsetting things that they did to make them look more alive. Or not did, which is also in there, which is also upsetting. So look at that at your own caution, of course. So other funeral practices for the Victorians, they usually held their funerals at home, partially at home, sometimes at a church, but rarely at a church, and definitely very rarely in a funeral parlor in the early 19th century. Flowers were very common. Sometimes the Victorians had crazy and very elaborate and sometimes bizarre floral arrangements, and those usually made the papers if they were especially weird. But some people were very opposed to flowers. They thought that they made the disease worse. Like if the dead person was diseased, they thought it made the disease spread. And some people thought they were very pagan. So particularly religious people did not like flowers. And there was such a thing as funeral fanciers. These were people who attended funerals for fun. They were pretty common, actually. And from what this book said, they were usually pretty sympathetic of the people and wanted to go as a way to comfort, and they found comfort in themselves and comforting others. And not many of them were just sadistic weirdos, And then people could also hire professional mourners to wail as loudly as may be required at the funeral. So if your funeral is not going to be emotional enough for your taste, you can hire somebody to come scream at it, basically. In the early 19th century, you would hire somebody to make your coffin. In the later 1800s, you would purchase one from a catalog. Hearses became more common as city centers expanded. Usually the cemeteries beforehand were in the city by a church, very clustered, clumped together, very small. Later on, they would put them outside of the cities for sanitary purposes. So hearses, you didn't want to have a foot procession to go, 3 miles out of the city. So they made the hearses. And then they put these big plumes on the funeral hearses that usually, the more plumes you had, the more wealthy you were. And I'll show you Abe Lincoln's funeral hearse later that has a whole bunch of big old plumes on it. So like I said, they were being buried in church or city cemeteries in the early 1800s. And the dead often were stacked on top of one another in overflowing heaps. This grew concern around public health and sanitation, as well as dislike for the general unpleasantness of the smell of the city morgue, where the bodies had to wait before burial. Cemeteries were described as a massive corruption that poisoned the air and water, and half-decomposed interments were removed to make fresh graves. So there was definitely a reform that was needed right around the middle of the 19th century. And this is why they moved the cemeteries to the outside later on. And a lot of times those people in those cramped cemeteries were moved to the outside ones. We have some in our own city that had been moved from smaller cemeteries to either make way for other buildings or, just because it was overcrowded. Gravestones of the late 1700s and early 1800s were very simple, and they kind of embraced death in a very matter-of-fact and sometimes gruesome way. Many included skulls with wings or skull and crossbones, and they had really harsh epitaphs. And I found some really weird examples, like this rose was sweet a while, but now is odor vile. And then, oh, would that I could lift the lid and peer within the grave and watch the greedy worms that eat away the dead. So, yeah, and obviously later in the 19th century, epitaphs were starting to read more of hope and joy and religious sentiments and, being with God and all that. So they're a lot more lighthearted than they were before. So now we're going to talk about the profession itself, the undertaker. I say undertaking the undesirable because it was a necessity. So at the beginning of the 19th century, undertaking was not a singular job. There were no funeral directors. There were multiple professions that occasionally dealt with different aspects of the funeral business. So cabinet makers, funeral furniture salesmen, and upholsterers would usually make your coffins, and they would advertise them alongside their other goods. So, fireproof depositories, cabinet maker, upholsterer, house furnisher, and undertaker. So, and they usually did this because they realized that it was going to make them more money. They found that, I made a coffin, I can also embalm the body. Why not? I'll give it a shot. So that usually happened. Stable owners had carriages that they used as hearses, so sometimes the stable owners would then try their hand at directing a whole funeral. And several different types of people experimented with preservation. Barber surgeons were originally kind of the surgeons of the day. They cut hair and they also practiced bloodletting, which bloodletting could lead to death, so they kind of had to learn how to take care of the dead after that. Nurses constantly had to clean the dead, and so they sometimes were learning how to preserve. Church sextons, who were the kind of early funeral directors, anatomists who were studying the human body. All these different people were experimenting with preservation and different methods of that. And sometimes the businesses would overlap. Any way you could make more money. And it didn't mean that they were good at it or that they had perfected it by any means. They just were available to try it out. And there was a lot of competition between different types of professionals, like the anatomists, the science, people of science thought that they should be the undertakers. The cabinet makers thought we should be the undertakers because we make the coffins, and they had a lot of competition between that. But as the century progressed, undertakers who would perform multiple of these duties were beginning to advertise themselves and consolidate all the many aspects of death care. So you can see here, undertaker, embalmer, and also furniture. So yeah, furniture, coffins, and caskets. So lots of overlap, stuff that you definitely don't see these days. All right, so the call for preservation, everybody had different reasons for wanting to preserve bodies. Some wanted it for research, some just wanted to preserve the dead for because they didn't have a chance to bury them right away. And so many different methods were being developed. Embalming is actually a very ancient art that goes back to the Egyptians. They obviously did it very differently than we do. That involved taking out a lot of their internal organs and the mummification process, but ours is not quite as invasive as that. So one of the early popular forms of preservation were cooling corpse coolers or cooling boards. This was a table kind of that they would put the corpse on that would keep it cool for a short amount of time. These had their advantages and disadvantages. For one, the corpse could be entirely dressed and then ready for burial right away as it waits on the cooling board. And then they were usually also very portable, so they could move them. They didn't usually preserve the body for as long as other forms of preservation, and it was difficult for the corpse coolers. I don't have a picture of one, but they would cover parts of the body that would make it hard to see, so they weren't really good for displaying the corpse. And then it still continued to be used throughout the century, though, and it was used up until the beginning of the 20th century because this was much cheaper than chemical embalming at that time. Another common form of preservation was the airtight casket. So metallic burial cases that were believed to have preservative purposes, but also were to prevent vermin and grave robbers from getting into the coffin. They looked like Egyptian sarcophagi because they were that, shape of a human. And these were usually more aesthetically pleasing than actually useful for preservation. There were a lot of variations of them, but they could sometimes put in a gas or a fluid into these to help preserve the body. And one of the earliest examples was the Fisk metallic burial case, which debuted around 1848. And they were a lot more expensive than wooden coffins. So again, mostly for the elite and the rich. And it was claimed that they could preserve a body for months to years. I think that they disproved that because it probably actually caused the bodies to decompose more quickly from what they found from research. But John C. Calhoun was one person to be buried in one of the Fisk metallic burial cases. But the Victorians knew to keep an eye on these things because you have a dead person in a case and a lot of gases are being released that are building up. So sometimes they would burst, including the stuff in it. So it could have been a very unfortunate sight. And so early experimenters were using it to preserve corpses for anatomic study for short amounts of time. And then chemical embalming at first was limited to the very wealthy. It cost significantly more to preserve a body by embalming it than it did to put it on a cooling table. Ironically, it was usually the poor who mostly needed it because a lot of times the poor could not afford the rising cost of funerals. In the 19th century, funerals were becoming more and more and more extravagant and more expensive. And so the poor would have to keep their dead in their home until they found the funds. And a lot of times the poor lived in a single room home. So you can imagine being stuck with that for sometimes weeks. Ironically, I just said that. So chemical embalming was being widely experimented with throughout the 19th century, but especially during and after the Civil War. So the Civil War was largely a catalyst for change in preservation practices. Civil War soldiers on the battlefield that died needed to be shipped back home for burial. There were men that were hired to collect these corpses and to ship them, and often their duties did not necessarily include chemical embalming, but they did it out of a necessity because they wanted to give the best service possible to the people who were receiving their dead loved ones. And so they experimented with it, sometimes right in the middle of the battlefield, trying to preserve these people. 1856 was the first patent for a process of embalming the body by chemical injection. Between 1856 and 69, there are a total of 11 patents that were granted for various embalming fluids. And the earliest center of embalming in America was Washington, D.C., because the greatest number of war casualties occurred in and around the Capitol. Most of the best-known undertakers of the late 19th century established themselves as a result of the Civil War and the contracts that they received for the burial of the dead. And many of these men did not start out as undertakers in any form before the war. So they kind of got flung into this practice and then, again, realized it made a lot of money, so they kept doing it. Of the 600,000 people who died in the Civil War, approximately 40,000 of them were chemically embalmed. Also, to help make embalming popular were many important, usually political figures whose bodies were embalmed, including Abraham Lincoln. There's his hearse. You see all those big feathery plumes on there. That meant he was very important. Prior to Lincoln's death, there were a lot of misconceptions about chemical embalming. People believed it was an invasive mutilation of the body that involved removal of many, if not all, of the vital organs. And there was also a belief that you could not get into heaven if you were embalmed. But Abraham Lincoln, when he died, his body was embalmed, as was his son before him, and he was taken on a train back to his home in Springfield, Illinois, to be buried. And along the way, the train made several stops so that people could see the embalmed body of the president and kind of mourn together as a nation. And this was for many people the first time they ever saw an embalmed body before. And they were absolutely amazed at the power of this. And a lot of people waited in line for several hours to see him because of that, and just because he's the president. And so this was a very large reason why many people were beginning to embrace that. All right. So moving from undertakers to funeral directors, basically the summary of metamorphosis from undertaker to this was they began as merchants who sold funeral-related goods and services to someone who actually took part in the burial and preparation of the dead, from preservation to graveside services, and finally, by the end of the century, to somebody who would oversee the entire process of what would happen to the body from death until interment. And it wasn't until the end of the 19th century, about 1895, that any undertakers were required to have licenses to practice. So again, this was a lot of amateurs just trying their hand at this stuff. Soon, the funeral director could take the body from the home for preparation and preservation. Before a lot of the century, they had to do it in the person's home of the deceased. But they finally were able to take it away and have a venue for where the body could be made ready for burial, and also could provide a ceremony for religious purposes. Cremations also did not become popular until very close to the end of the century. So between 1876 and 1884, there were only 41 cremations in the entire country. Between 1884 and 1900, there were 13,281. So it was a crazy rate of increase there of cremations. But still, the total percentage of cremations to deaths did not exceed 1% before the turn of the century. So it was still very slow. And at that point, by 1900, there were only 24 crematoria operating in the entire country. So it was still very, very new at that time. All right, so some of the ugly truths of death at that time without all of the gory details, so I don't gross anybody out. The poor. The poor were the ones that had to deal with the harsh realities of death much more than the wealthy did. Funerals became increasingly expensive, as I said, and the poor could not afford them, often forced to wait with the dead in their home. The public death house, or the morgue, awaited those who could not afford a funeral. The morgue was the receptacle for the unidentified dead and dying. So people would often be called in to have to identify the dead in there. Now I can't read this because it's dark. Hart Island, that's the name. Hart Island in New York was, and still remains to this day, a cemetery for the unidentified and the poor. Over 1 million people are buried there. It was first used as a public cemetery for unclaimed remains in 1869, and some of its first burials were Civil War veterans. It has since been used for several epidemics, including the Spanish flu, to the AIDS epidemic, to COVID-19. Today, social workers still help people find their unclaimed family members on this island. So, yes, it's still being used, still being buried there. Body snatching was unfortunately a very real part of the Victorians' reality at that time. So as the scientific community progressed throughout the 18th century with new discoveries, new curiosities to understand and explore the unknown, there was a much greater need for cadavers for research. And that was a fairly new concept that went against a lot of religious beliefs, so people weren't exactly willing to donate their bodies to science. So of course the alternative became body snatching. It started as medical students stealing the bodies of the dead for their research, but eventually they began paying other people to do it, and that would these people would come to be known as resurrection men. And this was a rampant epidemic, especially through the early 1800s, and it got to the point where some people would actually murder other people in order to sell their bodies for science or research. Some of the most famous ones that did that were, and this is dark again, William Burke and William Hare in Scotland. 1828 killed 16 people and sold them to Dr. Robert Knox of the anatomy department at the University of Edinburgh. So, and then there's another example of them. That's supposed to be the Burke and Hare trying to kill this guy to sell him. And then another solution were coffins that were patented to help prevent this, such as the torpedo coffin, which literally exploded in the face of anyone who tried to open it after internment. So those, I know though, from what I read, not a lot of those were actually sold because it probably was dangerous to put it in there and put it in the ground. So. And then being buried alive was also a very real fear that the Victorians faced, especially in times of deadly epidemics. There were no machines to monitor your heart or your brain activity. Often the Victorians relied on a misted mirror, so they would put a mirror up to your mouth, and if it fogged up the mirror, they knew you were breathing, or felt your pulse to see if you actually died. And sometimes really drastic measures were taken to really make sure somebody was dead, such as electric shock, red hot pokers on your feet, irritating powders, needles underneath your fingernails, whipping with wet towels, burning the skin, or a necrometer that measured body temperature, and holding up the hand to light to see if it circulated with blood. Sometimes it was merely a waiting game. One way to really tell if a person was dead was to wait and see if they started decomposing. And that would sometimes take a long time. And it was called a wake for a few reasons. One was because they would stay awake all night with the dead to watch them and make sure. And then it was also, it was this belief that the dead should never be left alone. That was also a very big superstition at that time. Cholera was especially dangerous because that is usually a disease is what caused people to be buried alive because they buried first and asked questions later, basically. The infected died very quickly, and it was hard to tell the difference between the dead and the comatose. So that ended up in actually people pretty often being buried alive. But the Association for the Prevention of Premature Internment was founded in 1895, and one of their suggestions was to leave a flask of chloroform in the coffin with the deceased so that if they weren't dead, they could be pretty quickly. That would, help them, keep them from suffering, essentially. And then there were also, again, several coffins that were patented to help prevent premature burial, such as the one shown here. This coffin was designed to notify those above ground that the buried person was alive while also providing air for that person below the ground. So this thing, they would kind of turn this and it would pump air in, but also I think there was a light in here that would show. And then this is a book that was written about that time, Premature Burial and How It May Be Prevented. So new studies were coming out at that time. So, all right, that's it.